All right, I'm going to be so excited to get y'all this video. We are going to look at 10 fantasy football statistics that you just need to know. You need to know these going into your draft. It's going to help you identify values, help you avoid some players that are maybe going a little bit overdrafted. But before we get into it, please go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you find these statistics intriguing and you want to go find more key stats that are very valuable for your draft strategy in 2022, make sure you go get our 2022 fantasy football draft guide. Almost 300 pages of quality information, just like you'll find in this video. You can find that over on flockfantasy.com. And if you use promo code FLOCK before the season starts, you are going to get an exclusive discount. Or you could go sign up for our sponsor with Underdog Fantasy, where we are doing those real money drafts every single night. And if you sign up for Underdog promo code FLOCK, you'll get a 100% deposit match, and most importantly, our 2022 fantasy football draft guide. But let's go ahead, let's dive into this, and let's look at a player that is the perfect example of why diving into a statistical profile and seeing one outlier stat will matter. Let's look at Dawson Knox. But before we get to Dawson Knox, I want to give you a story. I want to tell you a story from 2020 to 2021 and an example of how a player gets dramatically overvalued in fantasy the following year after a quote unquote breakout. Going into 2021, a lot of people thought Robert Tonyan broke out because he was a mid tight end 1 in fantasy in 2020. He was the tight end 6 in fantasy on a points per game basis. But if you were listening to some people that probably are smarter than me that really knew what they were talking about, we were saying the same thing. But you could look under the hood and look at Robert Tonyan and realize, hell, this is a player that should not be drafted as a tight end 1. In 2020, he had a 10.95% team target share. He had 30 air yards a game. But the one statistic that stood out and was an extreme outlier was his touchdown rate. He had a touchdown rate of 19%. That means 1 out of every 5 to 6 targets Robert Tonyan had this season, he scored a touchdown on. Now, of course, you're going to assume that a touchdown rate in an Aaron Rodgers offense is going to be higher than league average. And we could say the same thing in Buffalo with Josh Allen because it's going to be such an effective offense. But here with Dawson Knox, I want to point out to you how this touchdown rate for Knox this past season, it was an outlier compared to what we've historically seen. And what wasn't an outlier were any predictive measures that we want to actually dive in depth on. If we look at his yards per route run, you had a yards per route run for Dawson Knox at 1.3 in 2019, 1.2 in 2020, and 1.3 this past season. If you look at his air yards per game, 32, 31, and 34. The one thing that spiked up was actually the touchdown rate. So I'm not going to be surprised if Dawson Knox slides back down and is all of a sudden a tight end 2 yet again in fantasy, a player that I am personally not that intrigued with. And right now over there on Underdog Fantasy, people are drafting him pretty aggressively. But now let's go into our next tight end. Let's look at Zach Ertz. And my number one stat that I have with Zach Ertz, it's not even really a stat, it's more of a fact. Would I surprise you if I let you know that Zach Ertz, who is seen across the community, I heard on a podcast this morning, someone say that Zach Ertz was 35. And I'm like, what? Zach Ertz is younger than Travis Kelce. And with Zach Ertz here, I understand. I haven't been drafting him very often on live streams because a lot of these streams we've been doing have been those best ball tournaments where weeks 15, 16, and 17 matter so much. And with the addition of Trey McBride, I do think that Zach Ertz has some of his production stolen down the stretch, but you shouldn't be worried about a massive fall off in play coming from Zach Ertz immediately to start the year, unless you're worried about the same thing with Travis Kelce. If you look at Zach Ertz, he was the tight end 10 on a points per game basis last season. This is a player that went out there and really changed his entire role in Arizona compared to what it was in Philadelphia. In the 8 games that Zach Ertz played with Kyler Murray last year, he averaged almost 8 targets a game. So in your regular fantasy football draft where you can go through, draft him, and then maybe sell him high after week 4, I like the idea of drafting Zach Ertz, expecting that 20% team target share he had to probably remain consistent going into this next season through the beginning of the season before Trey McBride is involved. When you have no DeAndre Hopkins, when you have no Christian Kirk in this offense through the first 6 weeks, then you can potentially look to sell Zach Ertz, say after weeks 4, week 5. But at this point, I think he's very intriguing. Now, if you were going to be drafting on Underdog Fantasy in those tournaments and you're looking for weeks 15, 16, 17, maybe he's not as appealing there. But if you're not drafting on Underdog Fantasy, if you are not hopping into drafts with us on the live stream, fix your life. Go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. Hop in some drafts for fun. Prepare for your 2022 main fantasy football draft with some very quality practice on Underdog. And when you sign up for Underdog Fantasy and you use promo code FLOCK, A, you'll have a ton of fun in those drafts. B, you will get our 2022 fantasy football draft guide. You'll get our rankings. You'll get our dynasty rankings. You will support this channel. You can find that link in the description. But let's go down to our next key stat. And this is going to be heading over to the game splits that we've had with Dallas Goedert versus Zach Ertz through Dallas Goedert's career. Just transitioning right from Ertz in Arizona to looking at how this should impact Dallas Goedert this upcoming season. Because if we look at the 15 games that Dallas Goedert's played with no Zach Ertz through his career, he's actually averaged close to 60 receiving yards a game compared to 35 receiving yards a game with Zach Ertz. He averages about a target and a half a game more. He averages about 3 fantasy points per game more. Across the board, Dallas Goedert is just a completely different player in Philadelphia when Zach Ertz isn't going to be there. I got good news for you. Zach Ertz is not there this upcoming season. Now, yes, he is going to have some serious target competition with A.J. Brown coming over, but I do think it's going to be an intriguing statistic to look at. Looking at Zach Ertz, his presence on Goedert, and how Goedert may be involved without Ertz in this offense. But now let's go over to the quarterback position. We'll talk about some tight ends just in a second, but let's look at a player that put up the best fantasy football season of all time at the quarterback position. Now, we all remember, Peyton Manning back in the day, looking at Peyton Manning, where in 2013, he had almost 5,500 passing yards. He had 55 passing touchdowns. You would just naturally assume, okay, that was one of the best seasons of all time if you're looking at counting stats for the quarterback position, that Peyton Manning had the best fantasy finish of all time at QB in 2013. What if I were to tell you that Peyton Manning that season, he went out there and he averaged about 28 points per game, but you know who got to 30? Lamar Jackson in 2019. In 2019, Lamar Jackson gets to 30 fantasy points per game, breaks fantasy football, only has 208 passing yards per game, but this is the new age quarterback in fantasy football. If you want to access that truly elite level ceiling, you're going to have some rushing. We'll get to another guy in just a second. Here this season, you had 80 rushing yards a game for Lamar, which is probably not sustainable. He's probably not getting to 80 again. But if you just do some quick napkin math here and you think about how many passing yards 80 rushing yards is equivalent to in fantasy football, I mean, you multiply that by 2.5, that's 200, 220, something along those lines, passing yards per game. And you're adding that to Lamar Jackson's passing statistics. Lamar truly has that elite level ceiling this upcoming season. I do have him ranked at quarterback 4. And now our next guy we want to go over to is going to be a very similar player. Here, I have him ranked as a top 5 guy this upcoming season. One of my most drafted players on Underdog, Jalen Hurts. With Jalen Hurts, let me tell you how many games he had with over 200 passing yards last year. Jalen Hurts had a total of 6 games with 200 passing yards in 9 games with less than 200. You would hear those stats and you'd go, oh my God, Jalen Hurts must have been a disaster in fantasy football. You must have never been able to start Jalen Hurts. But no, Jalen Hurts was the quarterback 6 on a points per game basis. He was a mid QB1. And now you're adding over A.J. Brown, who had 2.7 yards per route run. So A.J. Brown will be a massive upgrade over their rookie wide receiver, who was the wide receiver 1 last year, Devonta Smith. So you slide in A.J. Brown to that wide receiver 1 role. And so you upgrade your wide receiver 1, but you don't lose Devonta Smith. He slides over to wide receiver 2. So he's playing over Quez Watkins. That is an unspeakable upgrade. You have the number 1 offensive line in the NFL. So I guarantee you, Jalen Hurts is going to have more than 6 games with 200 passing yards this upcoming season. And if he takes a significant step forward as a passer, and he was the quarterback 6 last season, Jalen Hurts has it in his range of outcomes to be the QB1 overall. But now let's go over to someone that I know people are off of because he faded out down the stretch. But if you look at his passing yards per game, his adjusted yards per pass attempt per game. He has gotten better every single year of his NFL career. Kyler Murray has increased his passing yards per game from 232 to 248 to 270. That is just a straight lineup. Looks like it's not stopping anytime soon. He's increased his adjusted yards per pass attempt per game from 6.6 to 7.1 to 7.9. Now, we had some random rushing touchdown volatility this past season be down for Kyler Murray in 2021. So we had a similar finish in 2020 versus 2021. Now, what I will say is in your regular league where you have to go through and you have to draft some of your starting lineup, make trades through the course of the season, maybe Kyler isn't the best target right away, because I could easily see this offense starting slowly, which is the exact opposite of what's happened over the past few years, given the fact that they'll be missing Hopkins and Hollywood will be brand new to the team, even though, yes, obviously they played together in college, but still, I would be looking at Kyler as someone that if he starts slow, I am going to be pouncing. I'm going to be trying to trade for him because he checks the boxes that we want. He can be a high volume passer and he has the rushing upside. I really like that Kyler upside. Now, let's go over and give the opposite example. Let's look at someone that is the perfect example of why rushing upside matters so much at the quarterback position. Did you know Derek Carr was a top 5 quarterback in passing yards last season? Please, let me know in the live chat. Did you know that Derek Carr was only behind Tom Brady, Matthew Stafford, Patrick Mahomes, and Justin Herbert in passing yards? He was ahead of Joe Burrow. Now, what did this lead to? Did this lead to Derek Carr being the quarterback 5 in fantasy, quarterback 7 in fantasy, quarterback 10 in fantasy? Was he the quarterback 12? Was he a low-end QB1? No. Derek Carr was the quarterback 17 on a points per game basis. The quarterback that had more passing yards than Joe Burrow, who was only behind Mahomes, Stafford, Herbert, and Tom Brady. And it's because that touchdown volatility hit him, and it was very negative. Only a 3.7% touchdown rate. Now, what I will say is this touchdown rate will probably come up this upcoming season. Derek Carr will probably finish better than quarterback 17. But I want to use this as an example to illustrate the importance of rushing at the quarterback position. Having a quarterback that can legitimately just pick up 20, 30 rushing yards is going to be everything. I mean, if you read our 2022 fantasy football draft guide, when you read these bear case scenarios on guys like Matthew Stafford, Derek Carr, it's very boring because my case against them is like, okay, well, they don't run the ball. They don't have league breaking upside. Like if I go through 2 different scenarios here for you and show you quarterback A, great game. Oh my gosh, let's all applaud him. He was fantastic. He had 300 passing yards. He had 3 passing touchdowns as well. Their team won the game. Versus quarterback B, he was kind of crappy. I mean, he had 230 passing yards, 20 rushing yards. So not like he's Kyler Murray. It's not like he's Lamar Jackson, not like Jalen Hurts, but he can get to 20 rushing yards. Someone like Justin Herbert would be the perfect example. You're getting 20 rushing yards out of Justin Herbert during a week and then a rushing touchdown. What quarterback would you rather have? Would you rather have the quarterback with 300 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, or 230 passing yards, only 20 rushing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and a rushing TD? You would actually prefer the quarterback that just picked up the 20 rushing yards and the rushing TD in that environment. It's the craziest thing ever, but fantasy football is not fair. It's not. So when you think about drafting a Matthew Stafford, a Kirk Cousins, and Aaron Rodgers, our next guy, Tom Brady, I have some real concerns with. Because here with Tom Brady, we can admit that, yes, he is the best quarterback of all time. I literally lived in Tampa over the past 12 months. I love me some Tom Brady. But this may be the year. This may be the year it doesn't go well. He tried to retire at the beginning of the offseason, and there are 2 things that I'm concerned with. Those 2 things are named Antonio Brown and Rob Gronkowski. Their departure from this offense, I think, is going to hurt Brady significantly. Because if we look at the splits with Tom Brady, when Antonio Brown played versus when Antonio Brown did not play, he had 8 yards per pass attempt with Antonio Brown, about 7 without Antonio Brown. He had about 313 passing yards a game with Antonio Brown and about 290 with no AB. So Antonio Brown leaves, you're like, oh, okay, that sucks. I wish he was there. But of course, Tom Brady's still going to be Tom Brady. But to throw on the departure of Rob Gronkowski as well, where Antonio Brown and Rob Gronkowski were number 1 and number 2 in this offense and yards per route run this past season. We saw 5 games from Tom Brady with no Rob Gronkowski over the past 2 years. And in those 5 games, you had 281 passing yards for Tom Brady versus 300 passing yards whenever Rob Gronkowski did play. So if you stack these two things on each other, well, yes, Tom Brady is the best quarterback of all time. I don't even want to talk about the fact that he's 45 because maybe just age doesn't matter at all with Tom Brady. The departure of these two weapons and looking at the game splits is going to worry me very much, especially when we know that Brady sadly has no rushing upside at all. So now let's move over to our next quarterback that doesn't have rushing upside, but I think the efficiency may help him out. Did you know that Joe Burrow was the number 1 quarterback in the NFL last year in adjusted yards per pass attempt? Now, Joe Burrow wasn't top 5 up there with Derek Carr in passing yards. He wasn't number 1 in passing yards. He was sitting at 6. But the reason for this is the Cincinnati Bengals offense was so damn slow with their pace of play. They just simply didn't have enough volume to allow Joe Burrow to go out there and be the number 1 quarterback in passing yards. They played a lot slower, similar to like Green Bay, where Aaron Rodgers is hyper efficient. They try to win the game with their defense. But here, Cincinnati wasn't trying to win their game with their defense. The reason that they were slowing it down, at least from an outsider perspective, at least from my perspective, is probably because you were looking at this horrendous offensive line where the Cincinnati Bengals led the NFL in sacks allowed. Now, of course, partly that's on the offensive line. Mainly it's on the offensive line. Partly it's on Joe Burrow. But still, now PFF has them as a top 10 offensive line coming into this upcoming season with the adjustments that they made. And looking at the efficiency of Joe Burrow, I'm not coming out here and say, oh, you got to draft Burrow. I will say he does have rushing upside. I think that you're not going to find with a Brady. You're not going to be able to find with a Matthew Stafford. You're not going to be able to find with a Derek Carr. If we get to Burrow, he averaged 14 rushing yards a game in 2020. Literally just being able to pick that small amount up is going to be fine. And maybe another year removed from this injury, Joe Burrow could get closer to 20 rushing yards a game, which would be fantastic. But nonetheless, I really want to use this quarterback statistic to illustrate what could happen in this offense if you were to have this coaching staff decide, hell, it's time to take the training wheels off. Let's be Kansas City. Let's be Buffalo. Let's push this pace of play and really see how many points we can put up. Now, our last stat that I want to bring to your attention is going to be back over there at the tight end position. It's going to be with George Kittle. And I am going to try to convince you that George Kittle is one of the most talented players in the NFL, arguably the most talented. If you were looking at George Kittle here, George Kittle has 3 yards per route run over the past 3 seasons. I don't know if you realize how crazy that is. It's not like yards per carry where you're getting the ball and then they're averaging it out. No, every time George Kittle went out there and ran a route, you're taking all of his routes and dividing that by his total yardage. George Kittle over the past 3 years has averaged 3 yards per route run. If we compare this to Kelsey's sitting there at 2.4 over the past 3 years. Andrews is at 2.5. You have, I know everybody's favorite tight end to draft this season, Dalton Schultz sitting there at 1.45. Cooper Kupp was at like 3.3 last year. It's a bad situation in San Francisco, but Kittle is an elite level talent. It is very tough to pass on him. Now, of course, thank you so much for being a part of the Flock supporting the channel. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really hope you got something from it. If you did, go down there, drop that like and subscribe. And if you want complete access to our 2022 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, you can get that on flockfantasy.com or by going and making an account and depositing $10 with Underdog Fantasy and using promo code FLOCK. Both links will be in the description. But thank you all again. I appreciate you and hope you have a great day.